of our 6-week webinar. The topic for this week is Step 7, the Write-Up and Report. William Bannon of StatsWhisper, as always. Now, as always, we want to keep in mind where we are in the 7 steps of data analysis process. And we are right here at the end of our process, right? So Step 7, the Write-Up and Report. So we've done a great deal before this, and Step 7 in itself is a great deal too, which we'll see. So what exactly is the Write-Up and Report, right? What is this Step 7 here? Well, essentially, we're going to describe the results of our study in tables and text. And so when you're doing this, there are many formats that one may need to adhere to, right, depending on your profession or the journal you're submitting to, right? It could be APA, it could be AMA, or MLA, for example. Here, we will use the criteria set forth by APA. So what we're going to do now is we're going to review the body of the paper, and then we're going to use the sample manuscript presented in Sample Study 1. It's in the text as an example of how to complete each part of the body of the paper. And we're going to touch on each part, but we're going to focus more on the topics that have to do with statistical analysis, right? And the textbook covers all the other smaller pieces in much more detail. So the body of the paper. So this is a popular generalization of what the body of the paper should include. So 1, the abstract. 2, the introduction. 3, the literature review, followed by 4, the methods, then 5, the results, and 6, the discussion/conclusion. And that's a slash because sometimes there's a conclusion and sometimes there's not. Sometimes there's discussion, sometimes there's not. But many times there's both, so we'll put both together. Now the abstract. The abstract is typically short. It's a short presentation on our study. So it's basically going to describe, right, the study within 150 to 250 words, which is, about 4 or 5 sentences, right? So you don't have a lot of room. But within that small amount of space, you have to fit topics such as the research question, describe the methods, the design, the results, the data analysis, as well as conclusions and implications, right? So you have a small space to really describe the study, the results of the study, what the study is made of, the purpose, right? But that actually works in our favor. And you'll see why in this third point, right? So I often recommend to write the abstract first, right? Because it's a great way to focus your message and your study. You'll see each sentence says 2, 3, 4 really important things about the study. So it's a lot easier to write the rest of the manuscript if you write a really powerful abstract, right? So you could basically write an abstract and almost expand that abstract into the entire rest of the manuscript. Right? The other scenario is if you write the entire manuscript and then write the abstract, right? Which, you might want to write an initial abstract and then revise it afterwards. But the thing is the abstract can keep you from going in too many directions, and it causes you to really focus your point. So you'll see what I mean more when we show instead of tell, right? So our abstract for Sample Study 1 says that the study employs a cross-sectional design and involves a convenient sample of residents living in an apartment complex in a major northeastern city. So there's one sentence. You've already seen 3 or 4 important things. For example, cross-sectional design, right? Convenient sample, a major northeastern city, right? So it's an urban study. It's one time point cross-sectional, and the method of sampling is convenience, right? So 2, the multivariate linear regression model indicated that happiness scores were significantly associated with education and income level. So then we stated here the findings of our covariate variables. Then 3rd, the regression model reflected study participants that live with a dog have significantly higher levels of happiness relative to those that live with a cat, right? So there's our primary finding, right? So in that little space, we have a lot. Now the introduction. See, the word there, compelling, right? A brief, compelling statement. That's the important part of the introduction. It's like a hook, right? And then it gets people interested in the rest of the study. Right? So a brief, compelling statement regarding why the topic needs to be researched, right? So you're making your case, and the evidence you may use in making your case is that second bullet, right? So we may include prior theoretical and empirical research, as well as current knowledge regarding the study topic with clear citations. Right? So this is the why. Why is it so important to conduct our study? Why is it so important that people read it, right? So it's got to be compelling. So there's a specific language, right? We just can't say, you got to read this. It's really important, right? There's a specific scientific language that can persuade the reader in that direction, right? So we build up with a crescendo. So we say, the study of happiness is a well-researched area, right, that's been related to several outcomes. That's us indicating why it's important, because it impacts a lot of outcomes, including education level, income level, and other factors. We provide a citation, and optimally, each citation should be a study supporting what we said. So if we say income level, it should be a study that describes how happiness and income level, are associated with one another. And in the second bullet, this is a big however. Right? This is part of our compelling argument. However, the level of happiness has not been examined regarding regarding the type of pet ownership, right? So that's us creating like a need. So it's been studied. However, it's not been studied in this context, which should make the reader think, well, someone should do that, right? Which is good for us because that's what we're doing. So that leads into our therefore. Okay? So therefore, the current study will examine if happiness scores differ at a statistically significant level among study participants that live with a dog or a cat. Right? So these therefores and howevers, right? This is like the template. So if you wanted to put your own variables in there, your own independent, dependent, covariate variables, that's what it's there for. It's supposed to be a template. Now the literature review. It's tough to find instruction on how to do a literature review. And that's partly because it's sometimes it's different for every study, right? So that being said, I'd like to suggest a 4-point plan, right? So it won't fit every study, right? But sometimes it's a good general plan, right? So the literature review, the key words, it should be focused and finite, right? There's often many variables within a study, and there's often an extensive literature on each variable. And this equals the potential to go in many directions, right? it could get unwieldy really fast, right? So the 4-point plan here is to keep it from getting too unwieldy too fast. Okay, so the first point, right? And this may sound a bit like the introduction, and actually in a smaller paper, this might be the introduction. You might not have a secondary, longer discussion on the dependent variable. But on a larger paper, you may have that introduction, and then when you get into the paper, you have this first part, which would be an elongated discussion of the dependent variable, right? What it is, how it's measured, what impacts that variable, what does that variable impact, right? So a discussion of the literature upon that variable, especially in the context of your study at that time point. And then link your covariate variables to it. Right? So that's a secondary purpose. So this is where you can provide the citations for how the income and education are also linked to happiness, as well as any other covariate variables you may include. And then second, you want to discuss the independent variable. Right? So talk about the variables that impact the independent variable. How is it measured? What does it impact? The same thing. Right? But then, third, you want to discuss the link between the dependent and independent variable. How do they relate to one another? And where are the gaps in the research between the two? And then fourth, the fourth part, right, could be the fourth paragraph, you give it little headings. The fourth part is to enter the study map information, as in to say, this is what this study is going to examine specifically, right? Just like a verbal reading of our study map. Now, let's take this in terms of sample study 1. First, right? So this is our first part. First, we discuss the dependent variable. And as I said, the language is really important here. Right? So first, we might discuss what it is and how it's measured, right? And of course, this is in the textbook too, so this is like a little snippet just for the point of discussion. So we might start off, happiness is often measured as reports of a specific emotion, right? And we might discuss, how it's been measured in the past, how it's conceptualized, right? Because there's a lot of ways of conceptualizing it. Right? So that goes for any variable you're examining. How is it measured, right? How is it conceptualized, right? And then next, what are the outcomes linked to that variable, linked to that dependent variable, right? Now, of course, we're not discussing the independent variable yet with its relationship to the dependent variable. That's in part 3, right? But we might say, one of the most consistent predictors of happiness or whatever variable you're looking at is, for example, income level. Then we have our citation, right? So this is where we start getting into the nuts and bolts. We discuss the topic, what it is, how it's measured, what it affects, and what affects it. And we do pretty much the same thing for the independent variable, right? What it is, how it's measured. So our construct might be pet ownership, right? So we describe pet ownership as this, living with a pet, right? Having a pet, and then we might talk about the outcomes linked to it, right? One of the outcomes one might have heard is that pet ownership increases blood flow and your general overall health, right? So those would be the type of things we would put in this section. And then third, this is where we establish the need for the study, right? This is our however part, right? Research has not been conducted that examines if happiness occurs more or less frequently, right, on a more or less frequent basis relative to pet type, And then we link them, right? We talk about the link between the two. So we say evidence suggests pet owners with pets that demand more care, such as cats, evidence higher stress levels relative to those who own more independent animals, such as dogs. And that's intimating stress levels may impact happiness. Right? So there we go. And then our final sentence right before the methods is always that study map. The final paragraph right before the methods is always that study map paragraph, right, where we say what we're going to examine. Right? And it's our therefore paragraph, right? So therefore, the current study will examine if people that live with dogs have significantly higher levels of happiness relative to people that live with cats. And so that's the primary purpose of the study statement. And then secondarily, we might mention our covariate variables, such as bullet 2. Also, we're going to include several covariate variables that have shown to impact happiness. And then the significance, which is one of my favorite sentences in the paper, right, is a little self-aggrandizing, right? So this analysis represents the first study examining happiness of pet type, right? So that makes the reader really feel like, you know, they're reading something valuable, right? It's the first study done on this, and you are reading it, right? So the value really comes through that statement, or that clear statement, you know, that this is what we're looking at, and it hasn't been looked at before. Now the methods often includes, and as parenthetically, a lot, right? So the methods often includes discussing the recruitment of study participants, right? Informed consent, IRB approval, data collection, your sample, your measurement instruments, research design, and data analysis plan. However, this is kind of a lot to discuss, you know, in terms of our slide presentation. So all this is in the textbook. So right now we're going to focus upon the measurement instruments and the data analysis plan, because those are the most germane parts to our statistical analysis. Now here's an important point, right? To understand the statistical analysis, you must understand how each variable is measured in detail, right? So each variable in quantitative analysis is measured with a number, right? So it's imperative that we understand what that number means that reflects the variables, right? If we don't understand that, we can't interpret the findings correctly. Instruments. Now, many times you'll read a measurement instrument description, and it might be, you know, like several paragraphs long. And in many instances, that's okay. What I want to express here are kind of the hard-hitting facts that if you have to strip it down and just mention a few, to please include these few, because they will help you understand how the variable is measured. Right, so first, you might want to present, you know, a description of the instrument with references and the validity and reliability and in prior research, if that's available, right? So that's a little foundational background on the instrument, if the instrument has that. Now, other than that, the nuts and bolts, you want to mention the number of items on the scale, right? So how each item is scored, such as a Likert scale, like rated on a 1 to 5 point Likert scale, like our happiness items. The methods used to compute the scale, and they could be quite complex, but also they could be pretty simple, like taking the mean score. Right? And you want to mention the potential range of scores, right? Like minimum and maximum scores, what's the highest and lowest someone can get on the scale, and what the higher scores indicate. right? Do the higher scores indicate, for example, the most happiness or the least amount of happiness? And then mention the psychometrics, such as the internal consistency and Cronbach's alpha for your study. Now, if we apply this to our sample study 1, here we go. This is what this looks like. So first we see happiness is measured using a 5-item scale created for the study. Right? So we know how many items are on the scale, and it makes a big difference, right? What if it's 1 or 2 items? What if it's 50 items, right? What if it's 10? What if it's 5? So that all makes a big difference, right? If it was 100 items, some people might think, wow, did people really concentrate on each item, where it's reliable? If I say it's 2 items, you might think, well, that's not enough, right? So that's important to know. And then the items are measured along a Likert type scale of 1, strongly disagree, to 5, strongly agree. So now we know each item is measured along that scale. And then the scale is computed by taking the mean score of valid responses, right, which results in a potential range of scores of 1 to 5, with the higher scores indicating greater happiness, right? So all those things we mentioned in the last slide, they're expressed in that sentence. And so one sentence can tell you, just like the abstract, 3 very important things. Right? And then we want to mention the reliability, right, for our sample here. So we might say a reliability analysis was conducted that indicated acceptable internal consistency with a Cronbach alpha was 0.89. Right? So there we go. So those are all the essential points in understanding, behind that number, how is it computed, right? How is the number reflecting happiness computed? So now we know. Now, the data analysis plan is useful for many reasons, one of which is it's how to follow the data analysis and interpret the results. Right? So we're telling the reader, we're going to do this for analysis, A, B, or C. So they know going in what they're going to see. Right? And, of course, when interpreting statistics, this is immensely useful. They know what direction they're going in. Right? They know what to expect. That's why it makes the interpretation much easier. Right? So, as we've said many, many times, data analysis is a process. So, in the data analysis plan, we're going to describe each phase of quantitative analysis, each phase of that process. And then afterwards, we're going to mention, things like the checks of data integrity, right? This section has to be relatively concise, right? You don't have a lot of room for it. So maybe like half of a column, right? So you don't have a lot of room, so it's got to be concise. So for example, for sample study 1, right, this is relatively simple, right? So we say the data analysis plan in phases, right? So data analysis will be conducted in 3 phases, right? Pretty simple. So we tell the reader there's 3 phases. First, all the data are analyzed descriptively. Right? Second, the relationship between the dependent variable and predictor variables, which are independent and covariate variables, right, will be examined using bivariate analysis. Then we say, third, the predictor variables associated with the dependent variable at a statistically significant level, which is p less than 0.05, will be enter it into a multiple linear regression model, right? So it doesn't have to be that complicated, right? We could say these are the 3 phases, and they could be this straightforward. Then we come into our checks of data integrity, right? So we want to list, and this is kind of funny because, you know, each of these little checks might have taken a long time, but it just gets one sentence for all the checks if they turned out okay, right? So for us, our checks came out okay. We didn't have to modify much, right? But if we did, we might have to enter that too into this section. But for our purposes, we say, prior to data analysis, an examination of test assumptions indicated a satisfactory level of homoscedasticity, linearity, normality, multicollinearity, you know, checks for undue influence of outliers, all those things. And then we might want to mention our power analysis. Not everyone does, but it's okay to do. Right? So our power analysis indicated 85 study participants gave us sufficient power to detect a medium effect size in a multiple linear regression using 4 predictors, right? Pretty straightforward stuff, but it tells you a great deal about the study and really how solid all our methods and checks are, right? It's essentially our way of saying we did as much as we could do to make sure the findings were valid and checked. Then you might want to mention the missing data, right? Were there any missing data? How much were there? What did you do with it? How did you treat it? All those sort of things, right? For example, we have our beginning here, right? Data, they were initially collected from 105 study participants, but of those, 10 had missing values, right? In the textbook, you'll see that there are several more sentences to this piece which describe how much data were missing and how those missing values were treated. And then our 4th check of integrity is the measures, right? Like our psychometrics. What's the validity and what's the reliability, right? This was all discussed already in the instrument section, right? So that might not be in this section. It could be, but for our purposes here, it's not. It's back in the instrument section. Now the results, right? So all that was just the methods, right? We haven't even gotten to the results yet. So it's a process, right? So the results are presented in text and tables, right? And maybe intuitively, the text describes the tables, right? So let's consider the text and tables for the univariate analysis in sample study 1. So this is just a little snippet as an example, but this is how the paragraph is often started for the text, right? Table 1 presents, right? So that's a good way to start the paragraph, to saying that which table and what it presents. And what it presents is often the same as the title of the table. Okay, so Table 1 presents a descriptive analysis of the categorical study variables in the current study or sample study 1 for us, right? For example, we might say data indicated about half the sample lived with the dog. Then in parentheses you put the number. It's 47 people, which is 47% of the sample, while the other half lived with the cat. So n equals 53, right? The number is 53, 53% of the sample. And then we have the descriptive analysis of the categorical study variables. You can put how many people are in the study right there. N equals 100. And then you can see this is APA style of presenting those variables. Okay, no troubles. But remember, these are the categorical study variables. You also have continuous study variables, which also need to be presented descriptively. So we come to that, right? So you might have a table 2 that presents the descriptive analysis between the continuous study variables, the current study. Right? For example, you might say data indicated the mean level of income was so-and-so, $197,250, $197,000, pardon me, $250. And then also that's presented too in the table, right? You have the mean, min-max, potential range, right? The potential range is often left out, but that makes it harder to interpret because if the mean score of happiness is 2.73, that's a lot different if it's on a scale of 1 to 5 or a scale of 1 to 10 or 1 to 20, right? So it's always nice to put the potential range when you have it, right? So income, you don't have a potential range because it could be however much. So then, after the univariate analysis, we get into the bivariate analysis, right? So, same thing, we start off, table 3 presents an independent samples t-test describing study participants that live with the dog evidence significantly higher mean happiness score. Then in the parentheses, you could put in the mean of standard deviation. Then relative to those living with the cat, put in the mean of standard deviation for them. Then at the end of the sentence, put a comma and report the scientific notations, right? And this is all APA style again. So it's a t-test, so you see t equals, and then the value of the t-test is 3.76. It's on the output. Then the 98 is the degrees of freedom. And then you have your p-value for the test, right? So that's the thing with the scientific writing. You have to know where to insert those numbers. And then next, we have our table, right? So the text was describing the table. So the text was describing the t-test right there, right? And this is our table with our t-test, and then /F. The F is the ANOVA, which is the highest education level. Right, so this is all reported. And of course, when the ANOVA is significant, you have to put the asterisk, and then below, you can put the results of the Bonferroni test. This is also in the text. And then, right, so we had not only t-tests and ANOVAs, but we also had correlation analysis in this study, right? So we need a separate table for that. So table 4 presents the bivariate analysis of happiness and income level. So the Pearson-R correlation revealed a significant positive relationship between happiness and income level. Then you have, the value of R, the degrees of freedom, and the p-value, right? So it's not too complicated, right? And everything is just stated in this pentameter. So for as many variables as you have, you could list them like this. And there's our table, right? So that's the APA formatted correlation table. Come into what we could call the big kahuna of our analysis, right? Our multivariate analysis that we're reporting. So again, started off the same way. Table 5 presents a multiple linear regression analysis, examining scores reflecting happiness. Now, the first thing you want to state is if the model is statistically significant, because remember, if it's not, none of the other findings are believable, right? They're not credible. So that's the first thing we state. So we could say data indicated that the overall model was statistically significant. Then we put in the value of F, which is the value in the model, the statistical strength of the model, the coefficient, and the p-value. Right? Then the next thing we want to report, since we're talking about the overall model, is the R squared. Because remember, the R squared is sort of the effect size for the whole model. It reflects how much variance in the dependent variable is explained by the independent variables. So it's a model level finding. And so we report the R squared and the adjusted R squared. So then we could say furthermore, the model explained over 80%, and in parentheses we put the R squared and adjusted R squared of the variance in the dependent variable happiness. Right? So that's pretty good, right? It's a very big R squared, but, and then next we talk about the individual predictors, right? So we talked about the model level findings, then we talk about the individual predictors, right? How did the individual predictors impact the dependent variable happiness, right? And to take the independent variable as an example, we might say in terms of individual predictors, study participants that lived with the dog evidenced significantly higher happiness scores relative to those that lived with the cat. And then you put the scientific notations to B, which is the unstandardized beta, negative 0.23, and the standard error. And then you put the standardized beta, which is 0.15, and the p-value for the individual predictor, right? And of course, this is all describing our table, right? So here's our multivariate table, our table presenting our multiple linear regression examining happiness. So there you go. You can see on the bottom we have our R squared and our significance for the model. And then on the top and middle, we have our predictors, the relationship between the individual predictors and happiness. So it's all there. Now, the discussion. Right? So you're getting into the discussion after this. So the discussion evaluates and interprets the findings of the study. And editors and authors themselves have different preferences, but some people prefer to start with the statement of whether the study hypothesis was supported or not supported. And then they'll either start discussing the implications if it's supported. What are the implications if it's supported? You know, or if it was not supported, why? What are the alternate hypotheses that might be true? And also in this study, the discussion section often incorporates a limitation section, which describes the shortcomings of the study. Okay, so if we apply this to sample study 1, you know, we could say the study findings were supported the study hypothesis, right, that postulated that study participants that live with dogs have significantly higher levels of happiness relative to those that lived with cats. So it's a good first sentence to start off with, you know, just saying this is what the study found, right, relative to the study hypothesis. And then you get into the discussion. There are several possibilities for this finding, right, and so on. And the limitation section, for any study, practically, you can think of a good number of limitations. So my recommendation is just present the most salient ones. Okay, so the current study also incorporates several limitations. For example, the design did not allow for participants that lived with both a dog and a cat, right? It's a significant limitation. It's cutting out a whole part of the population there, right? And then the conclusion. Reasonable is a big key here, right? A reasonable and accurate statement based upon the implication of the findings, right? So the statement is what the findings infer, but it's important not to go beyond those boundaries, right? So, for example, you'll see in our discussion and conclusion, right, we suggest that future research be conducted based upon the finding, right? We do not recommend that everyone that owns a cat should trade their pet in for a dog to make them happier, right? So you see what I mean. So specifically, we said in our conclusion, defining the pet owners that live with the dog evidence significantly higher degree of happiness relative to those that live with the cat suggests, right? So suggests, right? It doesn't prove anything, doesn't mean anything. It just suggests, right, that future research should be conducted examining the topic further, right? And that's reasonable. It suggests that, right? So specifically, future research might benefit, right? So we don't say would benefit. We don't know if it would. It might benefit from incorporating a qualitative piece that includes probing questions examining the finding, right? So that just makes sense, right? So we have this finding. We're not sure what it means or how it got there. So in our next study, we have probing questions that ask people, you know, what makes you happier about your pet, right? What are the demands, right? What are the rewards, right? So probing questions to study the topic in greater detail, right? So a very conservative approach to our conclusion. Now, this is a very important point. This is the thing that helped me most in the learning of the write-up and report, right? So one of the best ways to develop skills in the write-up and report is to read published articles, right? You could sit there all day and write and rewrite and erase something on your own, but if you look at how other authors reported the findings and wrote there, for example, discussion, conclusion, literature review, and of course, you know, it has to be, you know, authors that are doing it in a way you want to emulate, right? So if you look at how they did it, you could get a lot of great ideas. You know, you'll say, oh, look, this is how they discussed this. This is how they reported that, right? And it stimulates your own creativity and your own writing, right? So there's no need to reinvent the wheel. You can listen to the voice of others while you're looking for your own writing voice, right? And that's actually pretty common in not just scientific writing like this, but in poetry and creative writing and fiction writing, right? This is something that's commonly done. I mean, you never plagiarize, right? But it's more of an idea of saying, oh, this is how this person did it, and that makes sense. You know, I like what they did. And it's often a great help. So there we are in our 7 steps of data analysis. We've gone through each of the 7 steps, right? So we did our study map, we entered the data, we checked our data integrity, we did our 3 dimensions of analysis, univariate, bivariate, multivariate, and today we reported the whole kit and caboodle. So I'd like to thank you for watching today's presentation, and as always, please email with any questions. I'd be delighted to answer them, and have a good week. Okay, bye-bye.